Well, before we get into tonight's topic denotatively, let's stand back and ask ourselves a very fundamental question to put this in a broader context. What is your most important stewardship? Some would say the family, certainly more than finances. I'm going to suggest that your most important stewardship is the battle for your heart. That's really the issue, the larger issue that we're going to be dealing with. Paul warned his protege Timothy in the second letter. He says, "Know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such, turn away." Indeed, this is one of the fundamental signs that we are clearly moving into the last days. And there is a path to oblivion, I'll call it. And clearly it starts by being in a society that's committed to secularism. Clearly we live in a culture which maintains there really is no God. And from that conviction, or lack thereof, comes the view that there is no truth. We live in a time when truth is relative. You have your truth, I have mine kind of thing. And Alan Bloom highlighted the fact that if you don't believe in an absolute truth, that puts a total valuelessness to history. And we wonder why in the universities our young people have no real interest in the great ideas of the past, because the quest for truth would be futile. There is no real truth. We each have our own. It's interesting, Isaiah warned us of this. People ask me, where is America in the Bible? And I say very clearly in Isaiah chapter 5, with the 6 woes. But the most typical one I'll highlight here, where Isaiah says, "Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, and put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes, and prudent in their own sight." So clearly, value relativism is what we're facing. That turns out to lead to the materialism we all experience. If there is no truth, then we become self-absorbed. The most important thing in our lives is ourselves. We are in the me generation. You can go to the book stands and find magazines to self, we, me, and so on. And this self-absorption, of course, is basically a form of materialism. He that has the most toys wins, or velocity makes any road seem right. The answer in our lives is to get more stuff. And clearly, materialism finds itself, sooner or later, bankrupt for lots of reasons. First of all, we'll discover even in the scientific realm, we find ourselves on very shaky foundations. And, of course, also materialism leads to moral bankruptcy. So what we're facing here, all of us, is what actually is an epistemological challenge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, its scope and limits. And we really are in a quest for understanding truth. Where do we get real knowledge? Furthermore, those of us that are biblically informed recognize that we also face this quest under conditions of a hostile adversary. An adversary whose primary weapons are deceit and disinformation. And so the study of knowledge, its scope and limits, is the broad thing. And the reason this is important to every one of us is Jesus Christ gave us a challenge, an imperative, a command. He said, "Be not deceived." He said that several times. Okay, great. How do we do that? What are our tools to prevent being deceived? So as we look at epistemology, and of course that's a very vacant study because it's generally taught in philosophy classes in universities, and it really becomes a massaging of definitions. But clearly most of the debate in epistemology had to do with does knowledge come from reason or from experience, and the rationalists, of course, committed themselves to deductive reasoning, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz being perhaps typical of the rationalists, but soon superseded by the empiricists, saying that tangible evidence is the key to it. Francis Bacon, John Locke, and others. And that, of course, led to the scientific method, the rise of modern science, and that's committed itself to empirical validation, that what we really know is what we can empirically, experimentally validate. Except it's interesting, as we look back now at the history of science, it has actually quite a list of dismal failures. There was a time when phlogiston was a theory of combustion. And of course, that was shredded by Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry. Then we had this theory about ether between heavenly bodies that, of course, was shattered by the Michelson-Morley experiment. And then we had the nebular hypothesis that the planets came out of the sun. This is still taught in most astronomy classes. It was invented by Swedenborg. Swedenborg was an occultist, and he sold the idea to Laplace, who did not check the math, who endorsed it, and then Kant took it and popularized it, and it's still taught today, even though with any knowledge of orbital mechanics, it's easily shredded because you've got 98% of the mass in the sun, and you've got 98% of the angular momentum in the planets, and turns out when you try to reconcile that, there's no way the planets came out of the sun mathematically. The nebular hypothesis, again, lacks empirical validation. Then we get into the whole area of the paradoxical nature of light. J.J. Thomson got the Nobel Prize for proving that photons were a stream of particles in 1906. His son, in 1937, got the Nobel Prize for proving that that light was actually a wave phenomenon. And so the paradoxical nature of light continues. And then, of course, we had the Setterfield-Norman hypothesis that light is not a constant, but slowing down. That was laughed at by physicists for several decades, and now recently is being confirmed through experiments. So even empirical science has its failures. And so that leaves us with some still pending enigmas. Do you realize that most of what we know about matter comes from a small sample? Scientists know that most of the matter in the universe is not visible. It's dark. It doesn't give off light. And they're searching for it, dark matter. What's astonishing is dark matter, as they call it, constitutes about 95% of the matter in the universe. So what we know about neutrons, protons, and so forth comes actually from a small sample. Then we get into microbiology with DNA. And we discover that the DNA is edited. When you make an RNA copy, you edit parts of it out and take the parts you need to code up proteins. And the parts that are left out, or extrons as they call them, are labeled in your textbooks as junk DNA. They assume it's just vestiges of a past evolutionary cycle or something. Well, now they discover that the junk DNA, as it's called in the textbooks, actually has value. It contains architectural information. But the shocking thing is, do you realize how much of the DNA is labeled junk DNA? Over 98%. So again, we could use some humility in these things. And then we get to particle physics, which absolutely pulls the rug out from under the foundations of science itself. Because we suddenly have the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, misapplied by many philosophers to other things, but basically it turns out certain things behave differently if they're being observed. And then we have the laws of causality. The idea of cause and effect, which is the primary handmaiden of science, is now shattered in the field of quantum physics. And then we discover that subatomic particles lack a property called locality, that all photons, it's been experimentally confirmed, apparently that all photons know what all other photons in the universe are doing instantaneously. These concepts totally shatter the philosophical foundations. That's the reason why Boltzmann committed suicide, one of the early pioneers, because he recognized the philosophical implications of quantum physics. But as you grab this, then you suddenly discover the thing we call reality is actually a digital simulation, that our so-called reality is just virtual. So as we go through and we look at materialism, which has shaky material foundations and, of course, leads to moral bankruptcy, we experience that in our society, what is the next bridge to cross? Where do people go that have committed themselves to materialism and discover it's found wanting? So we enter a period which some people are calling the death of the soul. We have a lost generation, a generation without God. An emptiness of light that you see in all quarters, all pursuits. As part of this is the impact of the media, which presents perception rather than reality. And this leads to desensitizing our emotions
is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.